The New Year's Eve celebration was anticipated to be a warm, intimate family gathering. However, upon entering her daughter's apartment, the heroine's mother was met with a disquieting scene. Only her son-in-law and his relatives occupied the festive table. Her beloved daughter and grandchildren were nowhere in sight. "Where are my daughter and grandchildren?" she inquired, bewildered. "I sent them all away. Your mother can't stand them," the husband declared with a proud air. "Greetings, esteemed listeners. I'm delighted to welcome you to my channel. I have an engaging new story for you. Enjoy." Irina Lvovna, a woman who always considered herself refined, had been an educator for 3 decades. She possessed remarkable composure, even when the urge to hurl a grade book at a particularly insolent 9th grader arose. Upon her retirement, she finally had ample time to dedicate to her daughter and grandchildren. Polina, her daughter, was 30 years old and had 2 children, 6-year-old Timofey and 3-year-old Liza. These children were the absolute center of Irina Lvovna's world, especially after her husband's passing 3 years prior. Her relationship with her son-in-law, Eduard, had been cordial. He worked as a manager at a construction company, earning approximately 120,000 rubles monthly, which was considered a decent income in their provincial city. Polina also worked as an accountant at the same firm, contributing 65,000 rubles to the household income. They had purchased a 3-room apartment in a new building on the outskirts and were undertaking renovations themselves. Irina Lvovna frequently visited to lend a hand, whether to prepare a hearty borscht or to watch the children while her daughter and son-in-law were busy with tiling or wallpapering. Difficulties began to surface 2 years ago when Polina's mother-in-law, Lyudmila Fyodorovna, was widowed and began to aggressively insinuate herself into the young couple's lives. Previously, she had lived in a neighboring district with her husband, a former military officer, and had not been particularly intrusive. Now, alone in her 1-room Khrushchev-era apartment, she seemed to have been unleashed. She would call Eduard 10 times a day, demanding attention, money, and assistance. Irina Lvovna learned about these intrusions from Polina during their sporadic phone calls when her daughter would confide her woes. Initially, Lyudmila Fyodorovna simply arrived unannounced on weekends. Then she started criticizing Polina's cooking, housekeeping, and child-rearing methods. Eduard remained silent, pretending nothing was amiss. If Polina attempted to object, he would hiss, "Don't you dare be rude to my mother. She's going through a difficult time. She needs support." "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," Polina lamented during one of Irina Lvovna's visits. They were in the kitchen while the children were watching cartoons in the next room. "She showed up yesterday at 8 in the evening, just as I had put Liza to bed. She started complaining that nobody loved her, that her son had forgotten her. Edith rushed to comfort her, waking our daughter. Liza couldn't fall asleep until midnight and has been cranky all day today." "Have a serious talk with Edith," Irina Lvovna advised. "Explain that this is unacceptable, that you have your own family, your own boundaries." "I tried. He thinks I'm heartless." Polina's voice was laced with despair. "He says his mother is alone and I'm selfish." Irina Lvovna remained silent, but a storm was brewing within her. She saw how exhausted her daughter was. Work, children, household chores, and on top of it all, this mother-in-law with her endless demands. Polina had lost weight. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she had become nervous and irritable. The situation worsened in the spring. Lyudmila Fyodorovna declared that she could no longer live alone in her apartment, citing overwhelming, painful memories. She subtly suggested it would be beneficial for her to move in with the children, as they had 3 rooms and ample space for everyone. Eduard was enthusiastic about the idea, but Polina vehemently refused, leading to a major argument. "My mother is more important than your whims," Eduard roared. "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have married you at all. She said from the beginning that you weren't right for me." Polina then gathered the children and went to stay with her mother for 3 days. Eduard called, apologized, and vowed it wouldn't happen again. Irina Lvovna persuaded her daughter to return, despite her inner voice screaming that she should flee this mama's boy as far as possible. But where could she go? With 2 children. Polina's salary barely covered their living expenses, and renting an apartment was out of the question. Lyudmila Fyodorovna, realizing her plan to move in had failed, shifted her strategy. She began visiting on weekdays while Polina was at work and proceeded to manage the household. She rearranged items, discarded what she deemed unnecessary, and cooked according to her own recipes. Upon returning home, Polina barely recognized her own kitchen. Children's toys were packed into boxes to keep them out of the way. Polina's favorite mug had vanished into the trash, deemed old and chipped, merely taking up space. "Mom, I'm going crazy," Polina whispered into the phone. "I come home and feel like a guest. Edek says his mother is trying to help, and I'm ungrateful." "Let her help in her own apartment," Irina Lvovna responded sharply. "Polina, you need to draw a line. This is your home." But Polina was afraid. She feared losing her family, feared she couldn't manage alone, feared traumatizing the children. She tried to endure, but with each passing day, she felt something inside her breaking. An incident occurred with Timofey in the summer. The boy returned from kindergarten upset, explaining that Grandma Lyuda had confiscated his tablet, stating he played on it too much. The tablet was a gift from Irina Lvovna for his 6th birthday. Polina herself had installed educational programs and monitored his playtime. However, Lyudmila Fyodorovna had her own ideas. When Polina asked for the tablet back, her mother-in-law threw a fit, claiming she wasn't being respected and that her good intentions were being insulted. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Edward bellowed at his wife. "Mother is right. The child is ruining his eyes. You don't know how to raise children at all." Polina couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her bag, took the children, and went to her mother's, staying for a week. Edward apologized again. The tablet was returned, but the bitterness remained. Irina Lvovna noticed the change in her daughter. Polina became quiet and withdrawn, as if something inside her had extinguished. Meanwhile, Lyudmila Fyodorovna grew increasingly brazen with each visit. She no longer asked for money, but demanded it for medication, renovations, and a new fur coat. Edward paid promptly even when they were struggling financially. Polina attempted to protest, only to be accused of being callous. A major scandal erupted in the fall. Lyudmila Fyodorovna declared she wanted to celebrate New Year's Eve at the young couple's apartment, as her own place was too small and inconvenient. Edward immediately agreed. Polina objected. They had planned to celebrate the holiday with just the children and then visit Irina Lvovna. However, Edward was unyielding. "We will celebrate with my family," he stated. "If your mother wants to see you, she can come to us, but the main table will be for my mother." Polina tried to argue, but Edward resorted to shouting, accusing her of turning the children against Grandma Lyuda and driving a wedge between him and his mother. Polina burst into tears and locked herself in the bathroom. Upon learning of this over the phone, Irina Lvovna barely restrained herself from rushing over and giving the mama's boy a piece of her mind. However, her daughter pleaded with her not to interfere. "Mom, I'll handle it myself," Polina said wearily. "Just come over on the 31st in the evening. I'll give you the gifts for the children. We'll see each other, at least a little." Irina Lvovna agreed, though her heart was heavy with apprehension. On December 31st, she drove across the entire city with a large box of presents. For Timofey, a Lego set he had long desired. For Liza, an interactive doll. There were also sweets, fruits, a bottle of good wine for her son-in-law, and perfume for her daughter. Irina Lvovna spent nearly her entire pension, but felt no regret as long as her grandchildren were happy. She arrived at the building entrance around 9 o'clock in the evening. The windows of Polina's 5th-floor apartment were illuminated, and silhouettes could be seen through the tulle curtains. Irina Lvovna took the elevator, rang the doorbell. Edward, dressed in a festive shirt and slightly tipsy, opened the door. His face was smug, his cheeks flushed. Voices, laughter, and the clinking of glasses emanated from the apartment. "Ah, Irina Lvovna," he drawled, his voice thick. Come in, come in." She stepped across the threshold, removed her coat. The entryway smelled of tangerines and herring under a fur coat. Irina Lvovna proceeded into the living room, box in hand, and froze. About 8 people were seated at the table. Lyudmila Fyodorovna was at the head, with Edward next to her. Then came his cousins with their wives and some aunt in a raspberry sweater. Everyone was eating, drinking, and laughing. The television blared at full volume. The table was laden with salads, cold cuts, and hot dishes. But Polina was nowhere to be seen, nor Timofey, nor Liza. "Where are my daughter and grandchildren?" Irina Lvovna cried out. Lyudmila Fyodorovna turned to her, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and offered a venomous smile. Edward leaned back in his chair, squinting with satisfaction. "I sent them all away," he announced loudly with pride. "Your mother can't stand them." Lyudmila Fyodorovna nodded like a bobblehead. "Finally, the house is in order," she declared in a sweet voice. "No more tantrums and whining. Thank you to my son for coming to his senses." The cousins guffawed. The aunt in the raspberry sweater giggled. Someone clinked glasses. Irina Lvovna stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the gift box, and stared at this gathering. Something inside her snapped. For 30 years, she had taught children kindness, fairness, and respect. For 30 years, she had maintained her composure, swallowed insults, and resolved conflicts with words. But now, before her sat not people, but boorish creatures who had banished her daughter and young grandchildren into the freezing cold on New Year's Eve. She slowly placed the box on the floor. She took off her shoes, low-heeled and stable. "Irina Lvovna, what are you doing?" Edward began, but she wasn't listening. Lyudmila Fyodorovna sat with her back partially turned, still wearing a smug smile. Irina Lvovna approached, took her by the shoulder, and sharply turned her around. The mother-in-law gasped in surprise. "What do you think you're doing?" She started, but didn't get to finish. Irina Lvovna swung her hand and delivered a slap that sent her tumbling from the chair onto the floor. The aunt in the raspberry sweater shrieked. The cousins jumped up. Edward roared, "Are you completely insane?" He attempted to stand, but Irina Lvovna was quicker. She spun around and struck him on the face with the back of her hand. The blow was so powerful that Edward recoiled, stumbled over a chair leg, and fell backward, pulling the tablecloth with him. Salads, cold cuts, and glasses flew onto the floor. Herring under a fur coat smeared across the carpet. Lyudmila Fyodorovna tried to rise, clinging to the edge of the table, but Irina Lvovna grabbed her by the collar of her blouse and dragged her toward the door. The mother-in-law kicked her legs, shrieked and scratched, but Irina Lvovna was a head taller and significantly stronger. "Let go, I'm calling the police!" Lyudmila Fyodorovna wailed. "Get out of here, you wretch!" Irina Lvovna roared and kicked the mother-in-law into the hallway. She hit the wall, slid to the floor, and began to howl. Edward, by this time, had recovered, jumped up, and lunged at Irina Lvovna. She met him with a punch to the solar plexus, not hard, but enough to make him double over. Then she grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and dragged him after his mother. "How dare you throw out my daughter and grandchildren?" she hissed, dragging him down the corridor. "You damn mama's boy, you spineless weakling!" The cousins attempted to intervene, but Irina Lvovna glanced at them with an expression that made them freeze. There was so much fury in her eyes that even the drunken men cowered. She dragged Edward to the doorway, where the sobbing Lyudmila Fyodorovna was already sitting, and shoved him. He tumbled down, knocking his mother over. Both fell in a heap of limbs on the landing. "And don't you dare set foot here again!" Irina Lvovna roared and slammed the door shut. Silence descended upon the apartment. The guests sat at the disheveled table, stunned. The aunt in the raspberry sweater trembled, her hand pressed to her mouth. One of the cousins muttered, "Perhaps it's time we leave." "Get out!" Irina Lvovna commanded curtly. 2 minutes later, the apartment was empty. They fled, pulling on their jackets as they went, not looking back. Irina Lvovna leaned against the door, breathing heavily. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she had just done. She, an educated person, a teacher, had resorted to physical violence. But there was not a trace of remorse, only a feeling of wild satisfaction. She picked up the gift box, went into the room, took out her phone, and called her daughter. "Polina, where are you, Mom?" Her daughter's voice was hoarse and tearful. "We're sitting at a cafe in the train station. Edek kicked us out after lunch, told us to get lost before his guests arrived. Liza is crying. She wants to go home. I don't know what to do." "Come home immediately," Irina Lvovna said firmly. "I'm waiting for you. Edek won't be here. Come, I'll explain." 40 minutes later, Polina and the children entered the apartment. Liza was sobbing. Timofey was sullen and red-faced from tears. Polina looked like a wrung-out rag in a worn-down jacket, her cheeks red from the cold, her eyes exhausted. She stopped at the threshold surveying the wrecked living room, overturned chairs, food stains on the carpet, scattered broken glass. "Mom, what happened here?" "What should have happened a long time ago?" Irina Lvovna replied. "Go wash up, change, we're going to celebrate New Year's." "Okay." They cleaned the apartment and prepared new salads from what remained in the refrigerator. Irina Lvovna brought out the gifts for the children. Timofey and Liza brightened, laughed, and started building Lego. At 11 o'clock, they sat down at the table, just the four of them. Polina tried to get details, but Irina Lvovna waved her off. Later, for now, just be glad you're together." Edward called around 1 in the morning, his voice drunken and angry. "Are you completely out of your mind? Mother is in the hospital. She has a concussion. I'm suing you. You'll go to jail for this." Irina Lvovna took the phone from her daughter and replied calmly, "Sue me, but I'll sue you too, for kicking your wife and young children out into the freezing cold on New Year's Eve. Child Protective Services will be very interested, and I'll also tell them how your mother tormented Polina for 2 years. There will be plenty of witnesses." "This is my apartment," Edward roared. "It's community property," Polina corrected coolly. "I am a co-owner in equal shares. If you set foot here, I'll call the police for trespassing. So think about it." She hung up the phone. Polina looked at her mother in astonishment. "Mom, it's over, daughter. It's all over. Tomorrow we'll go to a lawyer. You'll file for divorce. Move in with me while you sort out the apartment. You deserve a normal life." Polina started to cry, but these were different tears. Relief, liberation. 2 years later, Polina sat in the kitchen of her new 2-room apartment and looked out the window. Snowflakes swirled outside. Laughter could be heard from the next room. Timofey was telling his sister something, and Liza was giggling. Soon her mother would arrive from the neighboring building with an apple pie, as promised. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. They sold the apartment, and the money was enough for the down payment on this 2-room place in a quiet neighborhood. Lyudmila Fyodorovna attempted to sue for assault, but the case was dismissed. Witnesses to that New Year's Eve suddenly claimed they saw and remembered nothing. However, Polina found neighbors who testified about how her mother-in-law had tormented her, how Edward had yelled at night, and how the children had been driven out into the stairwell. Polina changed jobs, landing a position at a major company, and her salary nearly doubled. The children started at a new school and kindergarten, making friends. Irina Lvovna sold her 1-room apartment and moved into the adjacent building to be close by but not intrusive. Polina encountered Edward once at a shopping center. He looked older, gaunt, and seemed to look past her as if he didn't recognize her. Rumor had it he married a quiet girl, whom Lyudmila Fyodorovna now treated like a servant. But for Polina and her children, everything had worked out. The doorbell rang. Polina opened it. Irina Lvovna stood on the threshold with a pie, dusted with snow. The grandchildren are home, of course. Come in, Mom." They went into the kitchen. Timofey and Liza rushed in behind, hugging their grandmother. Irina Lvovna smiled, placed the pie on the table, and brushed the snow from her hair. "Well," she said, pulling a thermos from her bag, "shall we have tea or just stand around?" Polina laughed and reached for the cups. The children were already eyeing the pie. Outside, dusk was gathering, but the kitchen was warm and bright. Everything was finally good.